Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up, as that will help grow my channel. If you'd like to subscribe, I'd appreciate that as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave those and I will respond. Again, thank you. This week's project is known as a swamp stick bowl. So I'm going to use these sticks that I found in the woods. They're actually cedar. They're fairly well decomposed, but I'm going to cut them up and put them inside this mold. And then we're going to use some epoxy that I have. It's a turquoise, and I think that'll turn out quite nice. We're going to turn a vase. So this will be the mold. I'll fill it full of sticks, pour the turquoise epoxy in it, and then we'll turn that on the light. So now you can see what I'm doing here. I place these sticks in the mold, which is just a picture that I bought from the dollar store. And I've just put the sticks, just place them in there randomly. And next thing I want to do is fill it full of water and pour that out so I can measure how much epoxy I'm going to need, which will give me a good idea. And then I'll dry the sticks, clean any bark off them, put them back in and pour the epoxy in. Here the sticks are ready to go into the oven. I just put them in the oven. Don't tell my wife. But I just set the oven on convection. You don't need convection. I set it at 350 and I left them in there for about a half an hour. Off camera, I measured the moisture of the sticks. They were less than 5%, so they're plenty dry. So here I am, the sticks are back in the mold, and I'm starting to prepare the epoxy to put into it. This epoxy was from a company called Timbercast, and it's a two-part epoxy. It's a slow-setting epoxy. That's one thing you want to look for with this type of a project is slow setting. Reason you want slow setting is I've got quite a volume here. I've got 1 liter of epoxy. As epoxy cures, it'll generate heat. You don't want it to get so hot that it will cause thermal cracking. This is a really good epoxy to use. It was slow setting and it never got hot during the time that it was setting up. It's also turquoise, so it came with a mica powder that you add to the epoxy, and the epoxy has an interferon in it, which gives it that pearl effect. So it's not just a color, but you'll see later it looks multi-dimensional with, like I said, a pearl look about it. I put the sticks in fairly tight, but they did tend to float up a little bit, so you can see here, I just put a bit of duct tape on them to hold them down for the first half hour or so until the epoxy started to set up. So you can see here now, as I zoom in on the colors, you can see how it's not a flat color. It definitely has that pearl effect, and it gives some depth to the color. The other thing you'll notice is that I do not have a pressure pot. A pressure pot is useful when casting epoxy because under pressure that tends to collapse any air bubbles. This epoxy, again, because it's slow setting, does a very good job at allowing the bubbles to be released, and so far I have not seen any air bubbles in this project, but we'll know more once we start to turn it. I really need to get a second monitor so I can see what you're seeing as I tape. Unfortunately, I had the camera going and it stopped and I didn't notice. So you missed this. But I've turned the outside down. I used a combination of my bowl gouge, seemed to cut it actually fairly well. And I also used my carbide scraper. And that helps shape it quickly. It shaped pretty quick. Although the pieces that were coming off were chipping out pretty good. Weren't leaving the smooth surface. You might be able to see a small chip here. But then I switched to my negative rake scraper, and that gave me a pretty darn good surface. There's a couple tiny chips, so now I've got to decide whether I fill those or whether I keep on sanding. There's one right there. But overall, the surface is pretty good. I started sanding at 80 grit, and yeah, it's come pretty well. I'm happy with this shape. I'll do a little bit more work down on the bottom, but I'm happy with this overall shape, and we'll soon switch to the front and hollowing it out. I'm going to continue to sand a little bit, and we'll decide what we do with a couple very small chips. But other than that, I think it's doing fairly well. I was about 15 minutes shaping the outside of this, and including the sanding that I've done so far. So I'm pretty well shaped now. Last time we spoke, the outside was shaped. I've done the inside. That took about an hour. That took a little bit longer, maybe 45 minutes. Mostly the carbide tool. I did drill a hole down the center just to make it a little bit easier to remove. Only a 1/2 inch hole, so not very big. I didn't film much of that. It's hard to show what's going on down there. Matter of fact, it's now deeper than what I can reach with my fingers. It's fairly smooth. I'm going to sand it now, but it's the thickness I want. Because of the shape, I apologize for the camera turning on. Because of the shape, it's narrowest here and then gets wide again. So I tried to mirror that on the inside as much as possible. It is thinnest right here on the inside, and it does get wider. Whether or not the wall is as thin here as it is here, it's really hard to tell. But I'm generally happy with the shape. So I will finish sanding. I do have a couple repairs to do. I do have a chip right here, which I'm probably going to have to fill with a little bit of epoxy. But other than that, it's in pretty good shape. So I'll just start sanding, and I will get ready to do some fixes. I have a couple cracks I mentioned to you earlier. I did fill those with CA glue just to give me some structural integrity. Once I take it off the chuck, I suspect that gap will close up a little bit, and then I'll fill it a little bit more. So I used 3 tools to get to the inside. I used my normal bowl gouge. I could use that at the beginning where the opening was wide, and it did a fairly good job at removing a lot of material. Once I got down inside a ways, I was forced to use, not forced, it's not the right word, but I used my carbide tool. It did a good job as well. I had to make some very light cuts because I didn't want to catch down there, which could damage the piece. So I did use my carbide tool, and again, it was slow going, but it did a good job. When I got down a little bit further, I used a tool that I don't use very often. It's called a ring tool or a capture tool, and you can see here how it's shaped, and it did a good job once I got down into the base of the vase and where it started to widen out again. It did a fairly good job at removing material and left a fairly smooth surface. Unfortunately, it's down in an area so deep that I can't feel it anyways, nor can anyone else, but I think it's fairly smooth just from the way the tool was riding in there. So now I'll just go move ahead to sanding. So here's this week's finished product. I think it turned out very well. So this is known as a swamp stick vase in this case, but you can see the epoxy and the cedar sticks. And again, I think it turned out quite well. It's about 7 inches tall and almost 6 inches in diameter at its widest. Up close, you can see the epoxy. You can see through it. It does have that pearl effect. You can see a good shot there. Overall, it turned out very well. I'm quite pleased with it, and this is for sale. Don't forget the contest. If you're watching the video, please leave a comment that says contest. to be entered into the contest to win a free bowl. The subscriber count has increased fairly well this week. Still looking to hit that 500 mark, but we got quite a bit closer this week. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.